Hello, and welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are diving into the fascinating world of how massive, highly complex organizations actually protect themselves from catastrophic digital threats. We're going to unpack the exact, battle tested methodologies they use to identify, assess, and respond to digital risks. It's a high stakes world of strategy and defense, and we'll be breaking it down step by step together. Now, listen to this. Cybercriminals infect endpoints with ransomware, encrypting files and locking workstations, resulting in disruption of operations. This isn't some Hollywood hacker movie script. This is a terrifying, real-world risk statement pulled directly from our source material. This is the exact kind of high-stakes reality that keeps executives awake at night. Literally, one wrong click from a privileged insider or one unpatched vulnerability, and an entire global operation just grinds to an absolute halt. Which really begs the critical question, how do enterprises actually survive this? How in the world do they operate, grow, and innovate when invisible threats are constantly probing their perimeter? Well, the answer isn't just throwing money at more software. The answer is a rigorous, highly structured methodology. It's about having a systemic approach to digital risk. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our playbook for today. Number 1, the anatomy of a risk. 2, step 1, risk identification. 3, step 2, risk assessment. 4, step 3, risk response. And finally, 5, continuous risk monitoring. All right, let's kick things off with section 1, anatomy of a risk, the building blocks of defense. First things first, we really need to nail down what we mean by a risk event. As defined here, it's a specific occurrence where a risk has materialized. But notice that ending, with or without actual loss. That is absolutely crucial. A risk event isn't always a smoking crater of a disaster, right? Sometimes it's a near miss. Maybe a threat actor gets in, but your controls actually catch them before any data is stolen. That is technically a non-loss event, but fundamentally, it's still a risk event that needs serious analysis. So, to manage these events, enterprises deploy 4 main types of controls. Think of preventive controls, like firewalls and two-factor authentication, as the thick outer walls of a castle. They're designed to stop an event from ever happening. But if those walls are breached, you need detective controls, like audit logs, to instantly sound the alarm. Then you've got corrective controls, like data backups. Think of those as your emergency medics rushing in to recover the system. And finally, directive controls, like an employee code of conduct. They don't stop a hacker directly, but they influence the behavior of your staff to prevent accidental internal breaches. To put all these controls into perspective, pros use what's called a bow tie analysis. Just picture a literal bow tie in your mind for a second. The knot right in the center, that's your risk event. The left side of the bow represents the causes. This is exactly where you deploy your preventative controls to stop the event from ever reaching that center knot. The right side represents the impact, and that's where your corrective controls sit, trying to limit the damage after the knot has been untied, so to speak. It's just a fantastic, intuitive visual anchor for mapping out your defenses. Moving right along to step 1, risk identification, seeing the threat. Now, what's really interesting about the ISACA Risk IT framework is how it frames this whole challenge. Notice how it connects everything straight back to the center, business objectives, because risk identification doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Under risk evaluation there, we collect data and analyze risk, sure, but it feeds directly into risk governance at the top and risk response on the left. It essentially proves that identifying a threat is fundamentally tied to broader enterprise strategy. You identify risks specifically so you can enable the business to safely reach its goals. But how do you actually communicate what you found to the rest of the team? Well, you use a risk statement. You distill these complex, messy narratives into a concise formula. Threat actor plus asset plus effect, and optionally, the method. For instance, our source material highlights an awesome scenario where a privileged insider, that's the actor, shares confidential customer data, the asset, via screen captures on WhatsApp, the method, resulting in a loss of competitive advantage, which is the effect. Suddenly, this vague feeling of dread becomes a crystal clear, actionable statement. Okay, step 2, risk assessment, measuring the impact. We do this using a highly tactical 5-step procedure. First up, you define the context, like what specific system are we looking at here? Second, identify the scenarios that could actually trigger a problem. Third, assess the inherent risk. Fourth, map your existing controls onto that scenario. And finally, assess the current risk. Notice the forward momentum here. We are constantly mapping and assessing to get a hyper-realistic picture of the threat landscape. Let's zoom in on steps 3 and 5 for a second, because honestly, this is where the magic happens. Look at this sharp back-to-back contrast. Inherent risk is your absolute worst-case scenario. It's the likelihood times the impact, assuming you have literally zero controls, or your controls completely fail. Current risk, however, is the reality. It's that inherent risk actively lowered by the design and effectiveness of the controls you actually have in place. The gap between those two numbers, that is the literal value your security team is providing every single day. And to plot all this out, professionals rely heavily on the 5x5 risk matrix. You map the likelihood on the bottom against the impact on the side. Now, according to our source material, this specific matrix is actually mandated by the Cybersecurity Agency to ensure consistency, which allows them to aggregate critical information infrastructure risks at a national level. It takes subjective, gut-level fears and turns them into a color-coded, standardized grid of green, yellow, and red priorities. Which brings us to step 3. Risk response, taking action. When you're staring down a risk, an enterprise generally has 4 core strategies. You can avoid the risk entirely, like deciding a digital product is just way too vulnerable, so you literally cancel the launch. You can mitigate it, which is the most common path, by reducing likelihood or impact, like throwing multi-factor authentication onto a system. You can transfer the risk by shifting the financial impact to someone else, like buying cyber insurance. Or, if it's a low-priority vulnerability, management might simply accept it, acknowledging the risk but deciding the cost to fix it just isn't worth the benefit. Basically, fight, flee, insure, or endure. But let's be real. In the real world, you've got limited budgets and limited time. You have to prioritize your response. Yes, obviously, high-severity risks in the red zone demand immediate action. But you also have to weigh urgency, strategic value, and crucially, control cost. If you have a vulnerability that can be fixed with a low-cost, high-impact control, man, that is a crucial quick win for your organization. You implement that immediately to drastically lower your current risk profile. And finally, Section 5, Continuous Risk Monitoring, the Watchtower. The absolute foundation of this watchtower are KRIs, or Key Risk Indicators. Think of KRIs as an early warning radar system. They don't sit around waiting for the breach to happen. They warn you when the risk environment is getting dangerously elevated. They act as a near real-time dashboard that relies strictly on hard data, not gut feelings, proving to management exactly how much risk load the enterprise is currently carrying. And these KRIs are usually tracked against very strict tolerance thresholds. Green means normal operations. Amber means watch out, it's time to take action. Red means sound the alarm and escalate immediately. For instance, if you track the percentage of critical systems with unpatched vulnerabilities, and they linger unpatched for more than 30 days, that indicator automatically shifts from green to amber or red. The alarm bells are literally ringing before the hacker even exploits the patch gap. Now, this leads us to a super vital distinction in monitoring: leading versus lagging indicators. Leading indicators spot the trend early. They monitor for changes in likelihood before the event even happens. Lagging indicators, on the other hand, simply monitor the number of events after they've occurred. Lagging is basically just counting the casualties. Leading is spotting the troops massing on the border so you can actually reinforce your defenses. Enterprise risk management absolutely must rely heavily on leading indicators to survive. But, what happens when an event actually does occur despite everything? Well, our source material gives this brilliant example of post-incident analysis by reconstructing the timeline. In this specific digital scam scenario, analysts traced the whole event back to T0, mapping out exactly when credentials were stolen and tracking the attacker's dwell time inside the system. In this case, the dwell time was 4 hours from T0 until detection. They used that bow tie diagram we discussed earlier to pinpoint exactly which preventive controls failed during those 4 hours and which detective controls finally caught them. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with this pretty provocative question to take back to your own teams. If it takes 4 hours to detect an intruder in your systems, what will your control redesign target tomorrow? Because the goal isn't just to fix the immediate breach, right? The goal is to continuously apply this methodology: identify, assess, respond, and monitor, so that tomorrow's dwell time is 4 minutes instead of 4 hours. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep learning and keep building those defenses.